Thank you, John. My name is Spencer Duran. I'm with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I'm the manager of the Section 811 program, and I've been at TDHCA for a little bit over 3 years. I've been managing the program, or I've been involved with 811 that entire time, helping develop it. And one of the biggest pieces that I was involved in has been securing the second round of funding. So we actually have an initial grant of $12 million for rental assistance, and we secured an additional grant of $12 million for rental assistance as well. And right now, just in general, the Texas program, like 35 other states around the country, is just now kind of getting its start. So I'm excited to share kind of where we are with the program and where it's going.
Diana McIver, and I'm president of DMA Development Company, and also Diana McIver and Associates, which does consulting. And I have been involved with the 811 program since its inception, and even before that. And that's why I think my part of the program is going to dwell on the history. But basically, we have done consulting for nonprofits on both 202 senior housing and 811 housing for people with disabilities, probably 12,000 units nationally, 43 different states. But most of our development activities have actually been here in the state of Texas. And we also are one of the development partners with TDHCA on their new rollout of the 811 program.
My name is Angela King. I'm the CEO for Volunteers America Texas, and I've worked for Volunteers America for 30 years. Previously as a Senior Vice President of Aging Disability Services at the national level. So I've been involved in development of a lot of 811 housing, but I'm going to speak to the dovetail of service funding and 811 and what's happening on the community side, some of the new rules coming from CMS and how they're impacting not only the future development of 811s, but current 811s that are operating in the marketplace, and some of the challenges that lay ahead in the short term trying to transition to comply with CMS's community rule. So that's specifically what I'll be talking about. Volunteers America is one of the largest providers of 202 and 811 programs in the country, and some of what we're doing to reposition our portfolio in compliance with that rule.
Before we get started, let me ask, has anybody been involved in an 811 program before, those that are out there, or is this something that you haven't been involved in, and just trying to find out some more information? Anybody been involved in it before? I see people shaking their head no. Okay.
Define involved. You mean building one?
Has done a development that's...
Use the dollars?
Yes. No? All right. Well, let's just...
Go into the whole thing, I don't know what 811s are.
Well, that's where Diana will take off with that.
Thanks, Diana.
Yeah.
And there'll be time for asking questions at the end. Diana, go ahead.
Okay. So I am going to take you through the history of how the 811 program started. And as I go along, Anne, you'll notice that I use some politically incorrect terms, but they were in the statute. So bear with me as I go through the history of the program. So essentially, the 811 program is an offshoot of the 202 program. And the 202 program, which is housing for the elderly, was created back in 1959, a long time ago. And it served seniors, only seniors, and it really didn't even have any any income requirements other than you had to have at least 20% of your residents have incomes at or below 80% of the area median income. So it wasn't even really true affordable housing, and it had 3% loans. So it just cute little niche program, not a lot of housing built under it. But then in the age limit was 62. Then in the Housing Act of 1964, bless them, the Congress, decided that they were going to amend the definition of elderly to include handicapped people. And so that was their way. I mean, and how someone at Congress made some kind of quantum leap that a person with a disability had the very same needs as a senior is beyond me. But that's what they did in 1964. And so then they renamed the 202 program to be Housing for the Elderly and Handicapped. However, even at that point, 1964, they did not require that any set amount of units be set aside for people with disabilities, or even that they be made accessible. So, you know, we're still dealing with a product type that is not necessarily accessible, and particularly when you go back and see the facilities that were built in that era, they have steps all the way through them. So through 1977, fewer than 1% of 202 residents were non-elderly handicapped. Then along came the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, and that's where they created the 202 program as a direct loan program and coupled it with project-based Section 8. So they went from this 3% loan program to a loan, and most of those loans were done then at market rates, anywhere from 7% to 11.5%, and then layered on Section 8 rental assistance to each and every one of those 202s that were built from 74 forward. And then what they did at that point in time, definition-wise, remember we still had handicap as a subset of elderly, but what they did at that point in time is they removed the word physical from the term physical impairment and expanded the definition to include developmental disabilities. The removal of the word physical was intended to make persons with mental illness eligible as a occupant of a 202. It didn't really work. It obviously was a little bit too subtle of approach. So in 1978, in the Housing Community Development Amendments, the Congress made it clear that it was never intended to exclude chronically mentally ill persons from the program. And then they also created a demonstration program with then the Health Education Welfare Agency to better understand the needs of persons with chronically mental illness. And then they, at that point in time, also began to set aside at least $50 million a year of the 202 appropriations to target that for what they were calling non-elderly handicap housing. So that was beginning in '79 that they had that set aside. And then in 1982, they actually started funding housing for chronically mentally ill for the first time, making funds available for group homes and for independent living. And that finally started to create some separate units for people with disabilities within the 202 program. So it's still operating as 202 senior housing with this handicap label being incorporated, and then gradually they're putting a set aside in the 202 program to allow for separate facilities for folks with disabilities. Now I would tell you that right around probably 76, 77, 78, one of the early 202s that incorporated housing for people with disabilities, literally someone, a nonprofit, because all of 202 is nonprofit sponsorship, a nonprofit in the District of Columbia created a 150-unit high-rise for people with physical disabilities. 150 wheelchair accessible units, all occupied by people in wheelchairs. Amazing. Amazing. Angela's just... So
It was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. It was a very long time ago. So moving forward, we get to 1987, and in that Housing Community Development Act, they amended it again, the 202 program. They amended it to require that 15% of the total funding be set aside for people with disabilities housing rather than the 50 million. So they went to a percentage rather than the 50 million. But the significance of that act was for the first time ever, they bifurcated the rental subsidy from the loan proceeds. And so they created, if you're doing housing for people with disabilities, they created a rental assistance provided through a separate subsidy based on the total actual and necessary reasonable costs of developing and operating the project, not including the cost of supportive services. So that was the first time they really started to talk about rental assistance program for people with disabilities. And along that time, the world that we all live in, started getting rid of the word handicap. It continued forward in the statute for some time, but we got much more into people first language, and so you see a lot more of the statute, the program language from that point forward using the people first language. So then in 1989, the appropriations for 202 actually created different pots of funds for, instead of just the set aside of, of 15% of the funds, created two separate pots of funds, one for elderly and one for housing for people with disabilities. And in the appropriations over that period from 88 to 71, the Congress required that 25% of the 202 funds be set aside for housing for people with disabilities. Then, moving right along to 1990, 1990 was really, I think, the first year that at the congressional level, at the federal legislative level, that people really began to understand that a person with a disability did not have the same, not only did they not have the same housing needs as a person with, as a senior, but they also had a need for different amenities within their housing. And so things happen sometimes, strangely, but in 1990, Jack Kemp was the head secretary, and he had been a congressman from New York as well, but he also was a former football player and was quarterback for Buffalo Bills, I think it was. And he had a friend, Nick Bonicatti, who's, football player also, whose son was seriously injured, paralyzed from the neck down in a football accident as a freshman in college at the Citadel. And so Jack Kemp had this young Bonicatti kid, Mark Bonicatti, come and testify. And I was there at the hearings when this young man who was using assistive technology, but really was able to sit and talk about the needs that I think he was 20 or 21 at the time, that he had as far as housing. And it was a very, very compelling testimony. And because of that one sort of coincidence, a friend of a friend had a kid who had this horrible, tragic accident. Because of that, they created the 811 program in 1990 under the Cranston-Gonzalez Affordable Housing Act of 1990. So that was when the 811 program was really created as a standalone program. And at the same time, they took away the previous way of funding under the 202 program, which was to do what we now would consider pretty high-priced loans. By that time, they were 10, 11% loans, and the loan was paid back with Section 8 rental assistance. Well, there is nothing more expensive than Section 8 rental assistance paying back a loan to the government. So it was like the government was in your deal twice, and it made no economic sense. Section 8 was extremely expensive way to run the program. And so in 1990, what they did for both the 202 and the newly created 811 program was they did forgivable grants. So they're capital advances, and as long as you, the nonprofit sponsor, did everything right and kept it affordable and kept it occupied by the right tenant population, then you would not have to pay back that loan. And then they added a project rental assistance contract called PRAC to that. So in 1990, it changed for both 202 and 811 in that the nonprofits would go and get this forgivable grant, but every person living there got that project rental assistance that they would pay no more than 30% of their income towards their rent. Then at that point in time, initially, if you were doing independent apartments for people with disabilities, you could have as many as 40 units at one location. And later this became reduced to 24, and then 16, and then 14 as we got into more integrated housing models. And then the group homes that you could do under that program, initially you could house 8 people as part of a group home, and that later was reduced by HUD in their rules to no more than 6 people or whatever your state rules were. So at the time, I think it was the state of Alabama said you can't house more than 4 persons in a group home, and so that was the rule. But in Texas, you could do 6 persons in a group home, as Angela Wells knows, because we did a bunch of those. And so we, gradually that program was getting more and more into smaller facilities. Then, landmark year, 1999, was the Supreme Court Olmstead decision. And the Supreme Court held that Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits the unjustified segregation of individuals with disabilities, and ruling that public entities must administer services in integrated settings. So that rule really was the beginning, even though HUD within their program rules had gone to smaller and smaller facilities. That was really the ruling that said a person with a disability should be able to have choices and live in a community that is not restricted to just people with disabilities. And then following on that, not immediately following on along that, it probably took several lawsuits along the way, but in 2010, the Congress passed the Frank Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act. And this is what created a standalone voucher program to serve people with disabilities in integrated settings. So you're now, before you it was packaged, you got your forgivable loan grant and you got your vouchers, very critical to helping people pay their rent and to not be rent burdened. But then with the Frank Melville Act, they decided that it was the voucher part that was so essential, because with the voucher, a person with a disability could go live in a standard apartment community and use that voucher to pay their rent. So that demonstration program is the one that made money available to state agencies such as Texas. And I think there are only about 13 states that have taken advantage of the program now.
There's now 35.
Oh, 35. Okay, we're making progress. And then, so at the very same time, the Section 811 program, as those of us that were using it in the earlier version, the very last Section 811 NOFA came out in 2011. They actually didn't get those developments funded until 2012, but that program, as the nonprofits were using it, is now gone. And so that's 50 years after they first started doing housing for people with physical disabilities as part of the 202 program. So in the last 40 years, we've gone to a very large standalone housing community serving only people with disabilities to more integrated settings where a person with a disability lives among persons who do not have disabilities. We've gone from requiring people with disabilities to take the services offered by the service provider to a policy of being the individual being in control of their own services. So globally, and it's, you know, it's only taken 40, 50 years, but why, you know, at least it's happening. You don't want to do these things too fast, I'm sure, and it's the way our Congress works, I guess. But essentially, we've gone from a very, very institutional approach of housing a person with a disability to a very normal integrated setting of being able to house a person with a disability. So I see that we've made an enormous amount of progress. It just took us probably a few more years than it needed to. So that's the history of the 811 program, and now it's rolled out to the states, and the states can work their magic.
So Pam, for me, I think it's essentially HUD gives money to the states for rental assistance to expand permanent supportive housing for people with permanent supportive, significant disabilities. And it's both physical disabilities and mental disabilities. And then, Diana, you were saying about the Olmstead decision, and I think one of the rules that came out of that is, if I'm not mistaken, you can't have more than 25% of your units in your property be designated for persons that have a disability.
Yeah, I don't think it was part of the decision, but it's been part of the policy
rules.
evolving from that. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Next we'll hear from Spencer, and he's got more of the nuts and bolts of working with TDHCA on how the program works. So for you on the development side, who may be interested in incorporating some 811 units in your property, Spencer is extremely helpful in what all that process entails and some of the rules that apply.
Yeah, so I can kind of give just a general update of where we are right now. So TDHCA, we have secured owner participation agreements with 18 properties. So an owner participation agreement is the first document that you encounter from the 811 program once you make the decision to join. So far, 100% of the 18 properties have come to the program via the low-income housing tax credit program. So after you get your commitment, you then get an owner participation agreement to sign, and that owner participation agreement essentially says that you will give TDHCA a few basic documents. So there's the tenant selection criteria for your participating property, there's marketing materials, and then also we ask that you take the second step if there is demand for your property. And that second step is to sign the rental assistance contract. And that rental assistance contract is the actual HUD contract that would be between that would really get the property officially participating in 811. So we wanted to have that kind of owner participation agreement in place in keeping with the theme of choice to let us market the program, market your property first and see if there's an interest in your property by the potential residents. And if there's no demand, then we would not take that second step to have you entangled with HUD. So we were trying to kind of do you a favor and at the same time interject some additional housing choice into what is a pretty rigid program, because this is a project-based program. It's not a Section 8 housing choice voucher where you can go, you get your subsidy, and then you go house hunting. We are bringing properties into the program, and those properties are going to be the only ones that the qualified applicants can choose from. So we want to interject a little bit of choice there. just to kind of go back to the timeline. So let's say you do come in via the tax credit cycle. You would get your credits, you'd sign the owner participation agreement. Oftentimes this is, a very new program, but, let's say there is demand for your property. Then we would have you sign the rental assistance contract and then record the use agreement. And so there is a 30-year use, it's like a LoRa that you're probably used to, a use agreement that's filed with the local property record that commits your property to the program for the next 30 years.
So in addition to the LURA, there's a separate use restriction agreement that gets recorded
Correct.
that runs with, the covenants runs with the land.
Absolutely. It survives transfer of ownership and all of that.
But can it be, if you have a mortgage on the property, like the LURA, it can get wiped out by a foreclosure by the lender?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's a great Megan Sylvester question, but I don't think so. So that's just kind of what you would face whenever you're entering into the program. And along that timeline, myself and Bill Craner, who also works on the program, we try and provide as much technical assistance to the ownership entity to help help them answer their questions, and then also the actual property management company. If it's a new construction property, obviously once you've designated who your property management company is going to be, we provide on-site training to both of those entities, the owner and the manager.
Can I interrupt you again?
Yep.
So let's say a developer wants to designate 10 units. So he signs the agreement, and because you think that there's enough demand, but they only end up having 5 people occupying. So they got 5 units. Do they go, and they came in with tax credits, do they go back into the pool of tax credit units?
Essentially, yes. So
And how about if you do both market units and tax credit units? Can they put them back as market units?
they would likely just be the tax credit units in that scenario, because we're trying to grab your 60% units. So they would essentially probably revert back to that 60%. We could, if you did designate your market units, we've talked about that. I don't think there's really a problem with that. You know, the only limiting factor would be, you know, we weren't previously doing compliance on those units before. And then also we have a rent ceiling. You know, we can only do, you know, the higher of fair market rent or the 60% limit. So you might get kind of squished up against what we can pay on that unit. So let's kind of talk about maybe how a lease up might occur. That might help. So for a new construction property, it's pretty straightforward. We would have already done the marketing or I guess outreach for your property. So my job is to make sure that local service coordinators and providers understand how to make referrals to the 811 program. So we do the same thing for them. We provide a in-person training where we invite the local mental health authority, we invite all of the managed care organizations, we invite the relocation contractors, we invite, you know, just as many service providers and service coordinators as we can. And we will be marketing those properties, so that whenever it comes time for lease up, we hope to have a really healthy waiting list ready to go, so that whenever y'all start accepting people into your property for the first time, we will give you the names and information of you know, really good households. So we train the local referral agents, as we call them, those that make referrals to 811. We train them on the program rules, and we also train them on the individual property rules. Because again, that owner participation agreement, you handed us a copy of your tenant selection criteria. So then we use that to educate the local service community about the program, because I want to make sure that we have very smooth move-ins and lease-ups for the program. I think that the program's reputation might start to degrade if every time I send you a referral, they can't pass, credit criminal or landlord rental history screening. So that's what would happen for a new construction property, or maybe an acquisition rehab. For an existing property, like the one that Diana has in the program, what we're doing with that scenario is we're just accepting naturally occurring vacancies. So for Prairie Commons, for example, we have 10 units in the program, and as vacancies occur, Bill's phone rings and says, hey, we got a vacancy, and we say, great. We would look up the waiting list and make a referral to that newly vacated unit. If we weren't able to fill the unit, if Bill said, oh, actually, we don't have anyone who is looking for a 2-bedroom. We only have single individuals on the waiting list. Then we would say, we don't want the unit. You can skip us this time, but you're still committed to 10. So give us a call next time you have a vacancy occur. And that's happened at Trails at the Park here in Austin. We didn't have any households who needed a 2-bedroom unit. So we've had 2 vacancies that have occurred where the phone rang. They said, "Hey, Bill, we got a unit. Give us some great referrals." And Bill said, "I'm sorry, we don't have anybody. Go ahead and lease that unit up for your general tax credit folks." So hopefully the next time Bill gets a call for Trails at the Park, we will have a qualified household. So, we're working on ways to really train the referral agents, and again, those are the local mental health authority, the managed care organizations, lots and lots of service providers on, how to really make sure those waiting lists are filled with qualified households.
You mentioned qualified household a couple of times. What is a qualified household?
That's a great point. So, and again, it's a two-step process. We have program rules that are oftentimes baked into the statute, and then we also have your property selection criteria, because we don't trump any of your criteria. There are some things that you would have to modify to be in compliance with the HUD handbook 4350.3. So, for example, you can't charge late fees on rent. So you would need to modify your tenant selection criteria. So just going back to that, so there's program criteria and property criteria. So the program, you have to have, there's an age limit, so you have to be between the ages of 18 and 61, or no older than 62. You have to have a disability that conforms with a disability that meets the definition in the program. And then we were also asked, as the State Housing Finance Agency, to further limit the participants in the program. And so we picked 3 target populations: people exiting institutions, and institutions that we use that for nursing facilities, and also intermediate care facilities for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Youth with disabilities who are aging out of foster care, and individuals who have a severe mental illness diagnosis. So those are the basics of, and there's also the income limit. It's extremely low income. So those are kind of the program criteria. So when we're educating the local referral agents, we're saying, here's the big hurdles. Here's the things. There's also a few additional things, like you can't be on the National Sex Offender Registry. You can't, have been evicted from a public housing unit. There's some drug charge restrictions. So those are the program level screening.
On the income, what's the income restriction?
So it's 30%, or what I guess you would call extremely low income. Yeah, because they kind of changed the definition a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it'd be your 30% units. Well, let me rephrase that. So
You'd be
we
paying
can't
30%.
cannibalize your 30% units. You have to create an
Right.
additional, additional affordable units. So we essentially are wanting to take your 60% units, and then we're going to be putting 30% folks in those units, so you can still cash flow it just the same as you always did. We're going to handle the marketing for those units, and if we can't fill one, we will deny the referral. Or if we do accept it and it takes us a while, then we also pay vacancy payments. So I think that's a pretty good feature in the program. So if we say, yes, we want the unit, but someone's stuck in a nursing home and they're having trouble with some paperwork, we can make vacancy payments to you. I think it's 80% or 80% for up to 60 days of vacancy. And so we try to have some protections for the owners whenever we're referring people to the property. But again, we were really trying to work hard to make sure that whenever there is a vacancy that occurs, that household has already been pre-screened to hopefully meet all of your existing tenant selection criteria. So just real fast. So again, we have 18 properties that have each property has committed on average 10 units. And I'm hoping that we continue to bring on 18 to 20 properties each year into the portfolio. And all of our existing properties right now are accepting referrals. So it's been, I think it's been pretty successful so far. We're kind of in this period right now where the existing properties are finishing up giving us all of their paperwork, and we're waiting for the new construction properties to be physically completed.
For the developers, do they have to use a different lease form for these units?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are a few quirks. Yes, there is the lease. You have to use our HUD lease. If you're familiar with project-based Section 8, maybe you're a management company that also manages project-based Section 8. If that's the case, you are so far ahead of the curve on this. We've gone out and educated owners and their management entities, and they're like, oh, this is project-based Section 8, no problem. So that is pretty smooth. Some of the problems that occur is if you're the owner and the property management company only has experience in non-blended tax credits. So you have to use this lease that you're not used to. You can't just use your TAA lease. Also, if you just grab the document package from TAA, the application, there's a lot of application fees. You can't charge application fees. You can't charge fees on rent. So we have to essentially take your documents and make them conform with the requirements. So for example, if you deny someone, if you deny their application for housing, you have to give them a reason and you have to give them a chance to meet with you. They don't get to, again, there's no trumping of your criteria. You just have to meet with them and give them a specific reason why they were denied. Brooke.
Can you mention what you expect in the QAP? About 811.
Can I?
Yeah, Wayne.
So for the 2017?
Yeah.
Yes. So I know what I wrote for the.
Well, just the discussion.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So the 2017 QAP, we had a round, I guess one of the round tables that take place before the board meetings, and one of the topics was Section 811, and a lot of the input we got. We got a lot of great input from some community members that were there and a lot of developers also. And I know that Tim Irvine indicated that Section 811 should just be made threshold for all multifamily programs starting with the 2017 low-income housing tax credit cycle. So previously, we were a point item in the QAP for the 2015 and the current 2016 round. But that there was, we had a little bit of some struggles with needing to spend our money. So we have this problem of needing existing properties to come into the program. So we were trying to think of ways to incentivize already constructed properties to come into the program. So I think I initially proposed an additional point incentive if you had an existing property in your portfolio versus you having a new construction property that you would be bringing to the program. And that isn't fair because let's say you're new to Texas, you don't have an existing property that you can give to the program. So we're all kind of, really trying to, struggle with how to, level the playing field. And so the consensus, I don't know about consensus, that's a big word, but the feeling in the room, and also Tim said, that, okay, we'll just level it out. We'll try threshold for the 2017 cycle.
So tell me what that means. Does that mean that every application that comes in has to agree to participate? What does that mean?
Yes.
And it includes the loan program and the 4% bond program, which it did not in the past because of the scoring fee.
Okay.
Yes, and there's a few exclusions.
Okay.
So you can't, so again, because we have that age restriction on the property, so you can't be over the age of 62.
Right.
So, there's going to be some, de facto or maybe actual exclusions from the
But
program.
are you going to also remove the geographical exclusions? Because right now there's only 7 or 8 geographical areas that a developer is eligible to put into the pool.
No, so it would basically be those geographic areas
Okay.
that we're targeting. And we're always looking at ways to tweak the program. So for example, we added Corpus Christi based on input from advocates. That was through the Promoting Independence Advisory Committee, and then they made a comment on the qualified allocation plan during the public comment period. So we modified the program that way.
Okay.
So we have tweaked the geographies in the past.
I think you need to add some more,
Add some more areas.
Well,
like Waco.
Waco, yeah, that's a mention.
Yeah.
Okay.
The service array has to be
Amarillo.
rich enough to support it. That's
Yeah.
part of the problem.
Yeah.
And for those of you that haven't used the program, basically you, as a developer, could qualify for this point if you agreed to participate in the 811 program, but you had to have a development that was in basically the major metropolitan areas, so Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio,
El Paso, Brownsville, Harlem.
and so then they added Corpus, but there's still, I don't even think Amarillo's in it yet.
No, Amarillo, San Angelo.
Yeah, and those are places that could support it.
Yeah, there has to be the service funding available too. This is not just a housing development issue. It has to dovetail with the Medicaid program, so your referrals come with service funding. So that's part of the issue, is that the MHMR centers or the authorities operating in those areas have to be on board with funding the service part. So there's a marriage that has to happen locally to make the housing work for the individual who's going to need supports in order to live in an independent housing setting.
Is that required for participation? Do you have to have that in place?
Well, so
People are referred to.
what is required is that we have a closed referral network. So you have to come through one of the local authority or your managed care organization can refer you. So that is required because we want to ensure that those community-based supports are there. We want to make sure that you're getting referred through the entity that provides or coordinates your Medicaid waiver services, for example. So those long-term services and supports are there for you as you participate in the community. So the services are available, but they are not required for participation. And that kind of goes back to creating, affordable, accessible integrated housing, and also providing housing choice as well.
I mean, I have no problem making the services optional for the person who's living there. I was just wondering at the organizational level if the service and housing partnership has to be in place.
At the state level,
but-
it was a condition of the board.
Okay.
So it's happening, like, we have a joint agreement with, now it's evolving into DSHS, right?
Well, the agreement, so yes.
HHSC.
Yeah, so, exactly. So what Brooke is talking about is, in order for the State Housing Finance Agency to apply for these funds, we had to have an interagency agreement between the HFA and the Medicaid agency, which in Texas, that is the Health and Human Services Commission. So TDHCA and HHSC, we have a contract, and that contract says, HHSC, you will do all of these things. These are the services that your local contractors and providers will provide for 811 participants. You will make referrals. You will also participate in helping us solve any problems that may come along. So we have this thing called the conflict management system, where let's say someone is not paying their rent, or maybe they violated a house rule by not being a good neighbor, or they violated a lease, their lease. If the landlord thinks that that might be related to their services, or if there's any kind of problem with an 811 household, they can pick up the phone and call or email the HHSC point of contact. And so that point of contact can find out more about that tenant and prompt action by their service coordinator. So maybe the individual, didn't pay rent because they went back into a nursing home or something. We could troubleshoot that and find out what's going on with this individual that way. And also it protects individuals' privacy by having that kind of third party, by keeping the landlord out of the service provider kind of area. So by having that point of contact, it kind of, puts up a wall between housing and services, but still allows the landlord to solve a problem that may be services related.
So it's going to be a threshold item
Yep.
in 2017. So if you're a developer, are your construction costs going to go up? Is there any additional requirements of those units?
Well, we have
Increased construction costs?
no. We
No?
have the experience from the 2015 round. Because the tax credit property is already subject to 504, they're already subject to all of these things. We don't ask that you create any new accessible units. Underwriting, I know, treats it. Asset management folks, they treat these properties just the same as one that was not participating. And some people may come into the program. They could have gotten their point item in the 2015 or 2016 round, but not actually have to do anything. So, because we don't know exactly what the qualified household or the applicant folks, they just may not choose to live there. We have 3 properties that are owned by Tropicana in San Elizario. So we don't know, and each of those properties give us 14 units each. So we don't know if there's going to be demand to fill all 3 of those properties. So we may end up modifying our agreement with Tropicana to say, well, we don't have demand for 32 units. We have demand for 10 units or 20 units. So we can modify the rental assistance contract to more closely mirror the actual demand.
Now, when it's threshold, let's say, back to Waco, let's say you go in 2017 and you're in Waco, and Waco isn't theoretically covered by the program in 2017. So that's a threshold item. So then you go 3 years down and maybe you've added Waco. So because that was threshold, it covers new geographical areas that come in, or do you, I guess I'm struggling with how the threshold works.
If you have a property, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, maybe Brooke could. If you have
Sorry,
a property,
Brooke.
basically, if you have a property that can't participate,
Yeah.
it has to.
Okay, but if it
What do you
if
mean it has to?
Can't, I mean, if it can't because it's not covered in one of the geographical areas, then,
You aren't committing in 2017 that if Waco ever gets added to 811, you'll now have to do it on that property. The way the QAP is proposed to be written for the draft that goes out is more along the lines of, if you meet the criteria for where an eligible property needs to be in the 2017 QAP,
Okay.
then that's your threshold requirement. If you can't meet that threshold requirement because you're in Waco,
Right.
you meet the threshold through doing a different.
Oh,
set of
okay,
things.
okay.
Yeah.
Back to the
Okay.
service.
so you're
whatever
taking the
it is,
point
Yes.
item and you're just moving it to threshold. Got
Effectively.
it.
Yes.
Okay.
So if you can't meet it, you aren't somehow held to something unknown in the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this, I haven't really. I don't have my talking points really, because it's so new. But yeah. So, but what Brooke said, yes, yes.
Yeah, whatever Brooke said.
Yeah, and also Mark Shelburne's back there. Hey, we have another national expert on 811. So if you have anything to add, if you have an empty chair, if you'd love to come up, please.
One other question, then if you are about done, we'll let Angela take it over and for the rest of the time. But so how long is the term of the contract
So it's
that you sign?
yeah, that's a kind of a confusing question. So that's a good question. So the TDHCA created owner participation agreement is a 30-year agreement. So there's that one. And then let's say that there is demand for your property and we ask you to sign a rental assistance contract. That has a 20-year term. And then the use agreement, or like the LoRa, it has a 30-year term. So it's kind of complicated. So there's 20-year term on the property agreement. The rental assistance contract has a 20-year term, but then the deed restriction has a 30-year term.
All right.
Okay.
Angela?
Well, that was all confusing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
My background is in services. I'm the incoming chair, board chair of Anchor, which is the National Disability Trade Association for providers of services to people with intellectual disabilities. This has been a huge issue for us as the lack of affordable housing becomes more apparent, particularly in urban areas all around the country. When we're talking about very low income folks, we're talking typically about people who are living on an SSI check, a Medicaid check of about $700 a month in the state of Texas. And that is it. That is their income. We may be talking about a few people who are drawing at Social Security as a child, disabled child of a parent. So they're drawing based on their parents' death or retirement, and they're drawing as a disabled child. So their income may be $1,100 a month. So that's who we're talking about from an income standpoint, which is why the rental assistance is necessary. And so as advocates and people with disabilities have pushed to be more integrated into the normal flow of the world, the old 811 program, which was segregated housing, either in very small group homes or very small apartment complexes, is looking to replace itself in integrated settings. So that's kind of what's driving this, and yet there's the need for subsidy because these folks, even at 30% of their income, they're never going to meet a 60% threshold or any other kind of threshold that's related to fair market rent. So that's the push to get this integration and get the subsidy. So that's who we're talking about from a how much money do these folks have. The other thing we're talking about is people with significant disabilities. We're talking about folks with lifelong care needs, folks who were either born with a cognitive disability or became disabled before the age of 21, or who have significant mental illness, and in this state that will mean periods of psychiatric hospitalization, and they have been defined through the SSI process to meet the disability thresholds, which vary from state to state, but they are significant. So we're not talking about a person with diabetes. And we're not necessarily just talking about a person who uses a wheelchair, because that in and of itself will not meet the disability criteria. So we are talking about folks who need supports. And that is why in all the states that are taking 811 funding, there is a mandate, just like there was in the old 811 program, that there be a plan for supportive services for each of those tenants, if you will, each of those individuals who are going to be occupying one of your apartments. So that there is a service provider who's going to say, you know, I'm going to be providing services to this individual's 20 hours a week or 10 hours a week or 30 hours a week based on what their supportive services plan is. In the state of Texas, that can come through many mechanisms, but it's all going to come through a Medicaid waiver. So that person's going to have an individualized Medicaid waiver plan. We are in the midst of dramatic change as those plans are now being managed by MCOs, by managed care organizations. This is the first year that the state of Texas is rolling out the CFC program, which stands, we've got a lot of acronyms, haven't we? Which stands for the Community First Choice program, which is now administered by MCOs, managed care, versus it used to be administered by your local MHMR centers. So now a person with a disability will have a service case manager, think of it as a case manager, who will be coming from the MHMR center. They may have funding and a care coordinator from an MCO, and then they may have a service provider that's a home health provider or a provider of services to people with intellectual disabilities. So they've got these three entities that are trying to manage their service array in this its evolving and changing program. So you may have some folks who are coming to you who've been living in a group home or in some other kind of housing where they're paying too much, they can't afford what they're paying. So, and they have a service provider, and they've had that service provider for, literally decades. They could have had that service provider for decades. And they're going to come with that service array to your housing. Woohoo! That's going to be great. That's going to be great because the service plan has been in place. They're accustomed to it. The provider's accustomed to the supports this individual needs. And they're really going to be coming to you for affordable housing, which is a crisis in disability services. There's a publication that's been around at least 10 years called Priced Out that's done at the national level that talks about folks with very low incomes being priced out of the housing market. So that's one way people can come, and they're on that waiting list, and they're going to be fairly easy to come in. Then you've got other folks coming perhaps from a nursing home, as all states are required to move people with disabilities into community. And they have a program for that that's called Money Follows the Person, where they're putting caseworkers in and figuring out what's it going to take to transition that person to community. So those folks will be coming in, and there will be quite a bit of planning around that to the point that was made earlier. Those plans can take 3 to 6 months to get settled as that person comes from a nursing home into community. And they will be fairly intensive, and a lot of folks will be involved in that person making that transition. And then you have some other folks who are going to be coming in referrals from the MCOs, from the managed care organizations, who by definition are working to make sure that they are supporting folks with disabilities with a service array, but this is their first, they're new to this game. The CFC is a new program, and making sure that that person's coming in with adequate supports is an advocacy issue that that provider agencies are very involved in. And I can tell you from our experience, because we have served a few folks now through the CFC program, and they are coming in with not enough services to support their living arrangements. And that is a problem. And it is a problem you need to be aware of, and you need to be part of the dialogue with. It's not, because there's a mechanism to get more services, but that caseworker has to be kind of on board to advocate for that. And that, so you got three different, in other words, three different tracks that I would say is how people can come to you. And that service array is important for people's long-term success if they have a certain level of disability. It is not required. People do not have to have a service provider to access 811 housing. But the reality is that most of them will, and most of them will choose to have one. And for most folks, that marriage of affordable housing and appropriate support services in an integrated setting is going to lead to a great life. And these folks are going to be very stable tenants. They're not going to move, very likely. So once they get in place in your unit, they literally can live there decades. Long-term care for people with disabilities can be 30, 40 years. I have folks that are still living in settings with Volunteers of America Texas that were there when we opened the programs over 30 years ago. And because they age in place, their service array continues, their eligibility continues, nothing changes. So from that standpoint, I think there's stability that should appeal to you as a property owner. And also, with appropriate services, folks are going to be successful. They're going to live in your communities and integrate, and they should be successful in their transitions. So a couple of years ago, at the federal level, CMS, which is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, after many years of promise, developed something called the Community Rule. And that rule said, here we're going to define community for people with disabilities. We're going to say, here's where you can live and get Medicaid waiver funding, and kind of we're going to imply that here's where you cannot live and get Medicaid funding. And from that, this transition to affordable housing in this model of integration is becoming more and more important. Because for the most part, institutional settings, which in this state means state schools, will not be eligible to get waiver funding. Some of our settings that are kind of campus-based, you've seen, if you live in Houston, there's Brookdale, there's some, the center, which is in Houston. There's some other places that are going to not be eligible to get Medicaid funding. In several states, the old 811 programs, which are 15-unit apartment complexes, and we have some of those here in Texas, are being told, folks with disabilities, these are no longer appropriate settings. And so what we're finding is referral sources are saying, you can't live in this segregated setting, even though you maybe have been living there for 20 years with supports of your own choosing. You can we're no longer going to refer to this 811 apartment complex because everyone that lives there is disabled. It's not integrated. Unfortunately, there's not anything to replace it. So what we're very concerned about is how folks who are living in some 811 settings around the country may be forced to move without a voucher, without subsidy. And Volunteers of America has been having some discussions with HUD at the federal level that as people naturally move out of our 811 projects around the country, these apartment complexes, which primarily serve people with long-term chronic mental illness, that they will be replaced by a low-income person who is not disabled. But the rental assistance will stay with the project. So the effect of that is there will be less affordable housing for people with disabilities. And we already have a crisis because, let's go back to the first point, $700 a month. We're very concerned. Now in Texas, so far, they have not said this won't work. These facilities aren't going to work. Because if you think about it, they're apartment complexes. There is no connection for the service array. In other words, Ms. Smith has her service provider and her service plan. Mr. Jones has his service provider, his service plan, and the two don't necessarily meet. So in Texas, so far, our transition plan has not said that doesn't work. But in other states, their transition plans do say they don't work. CMS has a timeline. They all have to be fully implemented by 2020, which sounds like a long time away, but when you're getting services for decades, it's not that long. So far, they've approved 3 state plans. CMS has approved 3, Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Nobody else's plan, no other state plans have been approved. So there is a big brouhaha at the national level about affordable housing for very low-income people with disabilities. And how are we going to push the 811 program as it's now envisioned to get enough housing to replace what we're losing and deal with the tsunami that's coming as people with disabilities who've been living at home with mom and dad are now needing affordable housing because mom and dad can no longer provide the supports they needed, or mom and dad are deceased, or one is deceased and the other one can't do. So you've got this increasing number of folks who need housing. And in many states, the state was supplementing the cost of housing in urban areas. So you had this very low income person living in Portland, Maine, and they had their $700 check, and maybe they had a couple of roommates who also had disabilities. And so together, they needed $3,000 a month to cover all their living expenses, their housing, and and the state said, okay, provider, we'll give you $800 a month. We'll make up the difference of what their Social Security or SSI will cover and what the costs are. And for many years, that was in place. That was the way it happened. And that's how we got people out of institutions, is we supplemented the cost of housing. Now states are saying we don't have the money to do that. So you're seeing folks who really are in this squeeze of affordable housing. So that's why the 811 program needs to succeed. So to the extent we can have that happen is these pilots roll out in 35 states, and we can be sure that the folks who transition first have the supports in place to be successful. That gives us something to build on. You know, success breeds success. So those are kind of the issues that we're looking at on the service array, so that people who are moving into your various housing developments are successful. They're successful as a tenant, they're successful as a neighbor, and they're successful as a person living in the community, just like any of us want to be successful and fully integrated. So we've had a few systems now where we've gone to HUD, because they don't have any statutory authority to do something except in little one-offs, and said, let's integrate this 811 complex. Let's move the folks out of this little group home, give them vouchers, let them move with a voucher. That's happened some, and then Volunteers of America will basically buy out the remaining mortgage. So there are things like that happening around the country, but there's no public policy yet on how we're going to really transition from what we had to what we want. And as you could hear from Diana's presentation. There's been a lot of changes in what we want in housing for disability over the years that we're trying to now incorporate. So that's kind of my take on what we're dealing with.
Your timing is terrific.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask us?
I'm curious, Spencer, how you quantify demand.
That's a good question. So when we were putting together our application in response to the HUD NOFA, we worked with our Health and Human Services partners to essentially compile that data for us. So we looked at the number of individuals in the target geographic areas who are between the ages of 18 and 62, and also who are Medicaid eligible. So we were able to identify, maybe a potential number of, I think that it's maybe 15,000 people. It's been a long time since I looked at the number across the state who meet that definition in the geographic area. And then we don't necessarily know their income, but like was mentioned, we can assume that their SSI level, making $634 or $734 a month.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway in case somebody may be thinking it. If you've got a market rate units in your project, the rental assistance that the owner of the project is going to receive, are they capped at the 60% rents? They're not going to be all the way up to market rate?
So, right. So we're limited to pay the fair market rent.
Which is neither fair nor market, by the way.
Sure. As HUD defines the FMR.
Yes,
We'll just call it
right.
FMR.
Yes.
We're limited to paying the FMR. And in some areas of the state, the 60% tax credit rent actually exceeds the FMR. So in those cases, we can go ahead and pay that. We have to do a market study. We saved you all from having to do a lot of work, I promise you. But yeah, FMR is our ceiling.
But that's not necessarily true fair market rent.
Oh, it's never true,
Right.
true market rent at all.
HUD's
formula.
published FMR is our ceiling.
You're right.
Right, so it's FMR or the 60% rate, whichever is greater.
Well, let me be a little more nuanced than that. So the maximum we can pay. Oh God, me too. So the FMR is the ceiling. That's the maximum that we can pay. And in general, though, the 60% tax credit rent will not exceed the FMR. In most areas of the state that we've studied, that's the case. In some areas of the state, the 60% tax credit rent does exceed the FMR. In those scenarios, what we're going to do is look at recent tax credit applications in that area and use them as kind of an aggregated, kind of ad hoc market study. So we know that in Houston, for example, there's maybe 5 or 6 tax credit applications that came in a similar cycle. What were their pro formas? What did their performance look like? And use that to justify the fact that we need to spend more in Houston to exceed the 60% limit, but going no higher than the FMR.
Anybody else have a question? No? Well, thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
These conversations
Thank you so much,
always
John.
so